I didn't choose the carnival. It chose me, or at least that's how it felt when my car broke down on the desolate stretch of highway leading to nowhere, and the faint sound of carnival music drifted through the still night air, drawing me toward its source like a moth to a flame. The place was decrepit, its faded tents sagging under the weight of time and neglect, but the lights flickered with unnatural brightness, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt of the abandoned lot. Against my better judgment, I approached the entrance, where a hand-painted sign read, "Laugh until you die." The paint smeared as though written in haste or perhaps desperation. My steps faltered as I noticed there were no other cars, no people, and yet the sound of laughter echoed faintly from within, an eerie, hollow chorus that set my nerves alight. The ticket booth was empty, yet a single ticket lay on the counter, its surface shimmering as if freshly printed, bearing the image of a clown whose grin stretched far too wide, its eyes piercing and alive with malice. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I hesitated, but the gates creaked open of their own accord, inviting me inside, and before I could think to turn back, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, propelling me forward as if the very earth conspired against my escape. The midway was a twisted parody of joy, its booths filled with grotesque prizes, stuffed animals with too many eyes, dolls whose faces were cracked and leaking some dark fluid, and mirrors that didn't reflect my image but instead showed fleeting glimpses of horrors too fast to comprehend. The air was thick with the sickly sweet scent of cotton candy mixed with decay, and the laughter grew louder, more sinister, blending with the distorted calliope music that seemed to emanate from every direction. I was drawn to the main tent, its towering spire reaching into the starless sky like a claw, and as I stepped inside, the world shifted, colors bled into one another. The ground undulated beneath my feet, and the tent seemed to stretch infinitely outward, its striped walls pulsating like a living organism. In the center of the ring stood the clown. He was enormous, his limbs too long and thin, his head too large and bulbous, his painted face grotesquely exaggerated with streaks of crimson that dripped like blood. His grin was impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and his eyes burned with a malevolent light, locking onto me with an intensity that made my blood freeze. "Welcome, friend," he crooned, his voice a guttural rasp that seemed to reverberate within my skull, and with a theatrical bow, he gestured to the audience. I turned, expecting to see rows of empty seats, but instead, the stands were filled with shadows, dark, shapeless forms with glowing eyes that flickered like dying embers, their laughter echoing in a way that was both human and utterly alien. My legs refused to move as the clown approached, his movements fluid and unnatural, his joints bending in ways they shouldn't. "Every joke needs a punchline," he hissed, and before I could react, the floor beneath me gave way, and I fell, not into darkness, but into a blinding kaleidoscope of colors that twisted and warped, pulling me through scenes that defied all reason. I was in a funhouse where every mirror reflected a different version of myself, each one more twisted and monstrous than the last. I was on a carousel where the horses were skeletal, their hollow eyes weeping black tears as they galloped in endless circles. I was in a maze of laughter, the walls closing in as the sound grew deafening, suffocating, until it was all I could hear. Time lost meaning as the clown appeared in every corner, his grin growing wider, his voice taunting me with riddles that had no answers, jokes that grew darker and more cruel until I could no longer tell if I was laughing or screaming. When I finally stopped falling, I was back in the center ring, but now I was the one in the spotlight, the audience of shadows staring at me expectantly, their laughter a low, rumbling growl. The clown handed me a balloon, its surface slick and pulsating as though alive, and whispered, "It's your turn now." I tried to run, but my body moved against my will, my limbs jerking and twisting as if controlled by invisible strings. My reflection in the mirrors showed not fear, but a grin slowly spreading across my face, the paint bleeding from the corners of my lips, my eyes glowing with the same malevolent light as his. The audience erupted into cheers as I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't a guest. I was the newest act, the latest in a long line of souls trapped in this carnival of nightmares. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the clown's face, inches from mine, his breath cold and rancid as he whispered, "The joke's on you." Now I stand in the ring, my painted smile frozen, my laughter echoing endlessly as I watch the next unlucky soul step through the gates, drawn by the same cursed music, unaware that they'll soon join the eternal joke. I had always hated clowns. There was something unnatural about their painted faces and exaggerated smiles, something that felt like a mask hiding something unspeakable. And yet, here I was, driving through a relentless storm in the dead of night, the GPS rerouting me to a back road I didn't recognize, a decrepit carnival sign glowing faintly in the distance. The name Hollow Grin Circus was barely legible under layers of grime, and my gut screamed at me to turn back, but the storm had turned the road into a swamp, and the car wouldn't move, leaving me no choice but to take shelter in the looming shadows of the carnival grounds. The moment I stepped through the rusted gates, the air changed. It was thick, suffocating, and the faint smell of cotton candy mixed with something metallic and rotten. The carnival was silent except for the distant creak of rusted rides swaying in the wind, their silhouettes jagged against the intermittent flashes of lightning. My flashlight flickered as I walked deeper into the eerie expanse, past broken-down booths with tattered prizes dangling lifelessly, their glassy eyes seeming to follow me. Then I saw it, the clown. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, barely visible in the shadows, but as the lightning flashed again, I caught its face. Pale white paint, smeared red lips curled into a grotesque grin, and eyes that seemed to glow like embers. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, and when I looked again, it was gone, leaving me questioning if I had truly seen it. I tried to convince myself it was just a statue, a leftover prop, but the uneasy feeling in my chest told me otherwise. I wandered into the big top tent, its once bright colors now faded and torn, the interior filled with rows of rotting benches encircling a dark, empty ring. The silence was deafening until a single spotlight flickered to life, illuminating the center of the ring, where the clown now stood, its lanky frame impossibly tall, its head cocked to the side as if studying me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as it took a slow, deliberate step forward, its oversized shoes scraping against the dirt. "You're just in time for the show," it said, its voice a chilling mixture of raspy laughter and guttural growls. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted, but the carnival seemed alive, its layout shifting as I ran, each turn leading me back to the clown, now closer, its grin wider, its eyes burning brighter. I found myself in a hall of mirrors, the distorted reflections stretching endlessly, and as I navigated the maze, the clown's face appeared in each mirror, laughing, its painted lips whispering words I couldn't understand. My reflection in the mirrors began to change, my face twisting, my smile stretching unnaturally wide, my eyes glowing like his, until I couldn't tell which reflection was real. Panicking, I smashed through the glass, only to find myself back in the big top, the audience now filled with shadowy figures, their faces obscured but their laughter sharp and mocking. The clown stood in the center of the ring again, holding a balloon animal that writhed and pulsed as if alive. "Every laugh has a price," it said, and as it released the balloon, it floated toward me, bursting into a cloud of confetti that clung to my skin like ash, burning and spreading until I felt my face contort into an unnatural grin. I screamed, but the sound came out as laughter, loud and uncontrollable. echoing through the tent as the shadows cheered and the clown's grin stretched far beyond the limits of its face. I realized then that the laughter was not just mine. It was every soul the clown had claimed, trapped within its endless, twisted joke. As the world faded into darkness, the last thing I saw was my own reflection in its eyes, my face painted white, my grin as wide and hollow as its own, my soul now part of the eternal circus, waiting for the next guest to stumble into the trap. It all started on the night of my sister's birthday when she decided to have a circus-themed party in our sprawling, dilapidated house at the edge of town. A place steeped in history and shadows, the kind that bred whispers among the locals. The decorations were festive enough, brightly colored balloons, streamers, and a vintage popcorn machine borrowed from the town's forgotten amusement park. But it was the life-sized clown mannequin, a gift from her eccentric friend, that stole everyone's attention. It stood in the corner of the living room, dressed in faded red and gold, its porcelain face cracked and yellowed with age, yet somehow its painted grin looked freshly applied, its eyes unervingly lifelike. Everyone laughed at how creepy it was, except me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, its gaze shifting when no one was looking. The party carried on, the guests gradually trickling out as the night deepened, until it was just me, my sister, and the mannequin, which now seemed to loom larger, its presence suffocating despite being perfectly still. My sister, tipsy and giggling, decided it would be funny to leave the clown in my room as a prank. I protested, but she was relentless, so I relented, thinking it was easier to humor her. I moved it to the corner of my room, facing the wall, and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, an oppressive weight, a prickling awareness that made my skin crawl. When I finally dared to look, the clown was facing me, its head tilted slightly, as if curious, though I knew I hadn't touched it. My heart pounded as I sat frozen, rationalizing that my sister must have snuck in to move it. But when I checked the door, it was locked from the inside. That's when I heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike, coming from behind me. Spinning around, I found the clown in the center of the room, its hands raised slightly as though it had been caught mid-motion. The air grew icy, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally toward the mannequin. Trembling, I grabbed it and shoved it back into the corner, but as my hands touched its stiff arms, I could swear the fabric felt warm, almost alive, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I threw myself back into bed, determined to ignore it until morning. But sleep was impossible with the soft sounds that began to fill the room. Scraping, like nails on wood, and that giggle growing louder, closer. At one point, I felt a tug on my blanket, and when I bolted upright, the clown was standing at the foot of my bed, its painted eyes gleaming with something dark and predatory. I screamed, throwing the nearest object, a lamp, at it, and bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock as the giggles erupted into full-blown laughter. A deep, guttural sound that didn't match the delicate features of its face. Bursting into the hallway, I found my sister's room empty, her bed untouched, though her shoes and phone were still there. Frantic, I searched the house, every corner filled with that infernal laughter. But she was gone, vanished without a trace. The mannequin, however, reappeared in the living room, seated on the couch with one arm draped casually over the back, its head cocked at an angle that seemed almost mocking. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge, and every window showed only darkness. No streetlights, no moon, as if the house had been swallowed by some void. My phone was useless, the screen flashing with distorted images of the clown's face, its grin growing wider with every passing second. The night stretched on, a nightmare of shifting shadows and impossible sounds. Footsteps running up and down the stairs, whispers and languages I couldn't understand, and the ever-present laughter that seemed to come from within my own skull. At one point, I barricaded myself in the bathroom, but when I turned on the faucet, thick, red liquid poured out, staining the sink and filling the room with the coppery scent of blood. Then the mirror cracked, the fractures forming the shape of the clown's grin before shattering completely, and in the shards, I saw dozens of tiny reflections of it staring back at me. I lost track of time as the house twisted around me, doors leading to nowhere, rooms shrinking and expanding, until I was back in my bedroom, exhausted and terrified. The mannequin was waiting for me, sitting cross-legged on my bed, its head swiveling toward me as I entered. "Why run?" it rasped, its voice like grinding metal, though its mouth didn't move. "We're just getting started." I blacked out after that, waking up in the middle of the woods at dawn, clutching a single balloon that popped as soon as I touched it, releasing a spray of confetti soaked in blood. When I stumbled back to the house, it was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds, and my sister was never found. The only thing left was the mannequin, sitting in the center of the lot, its grin now painted across its entire face, waiting for its next victim. It began on a cold, gray afternoon when I was forced to take the long way home after a storm had flooded the main road. A detour through the old industrial district, where factories once thrived but now stood as crumbling monuments to forgotten labor, their skeletal remains cloaked in rust and shadows. The area was infamous for its eerie stillness. Yet that day, something felt alive, an electric tension in the air that set my nerves on edge. As I trudged along the cracked pavement, I noticed something strange. A brightly colored flyer, pristine despite the grime surrounding it, plastered on a rusted lamppost. The Painted Abyss Circus, one night only. It read in bold, garish letters, with an image of a grinning clown whose eyes seemed to follow me, the ink glistening unnaturally as if freshly painted. Against my better judgment, I pocketed the flyer, my curiosity outweighing my unease, and continued on, though the feeling of being watched never left me. That night, as rain pattered against my bedroom window and thunder rumbled in the distance, I pulled the flyer from my pocket, intending to toss it, but as my fingers brushed the glossy surface, I felt an icy chill crawl up my arm, and a faint laugh echoed in my ears. A deep, guttural chuckle that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my room. A shadow too tall and misshapen to belong to anything human, but it vanished before I could focus. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of endless hallways filled with mirrors that reflected not my face, but that of the clown from the flyer, his painted smile stretching wider and wider until it split his face, revealing rows of jagged teeth. When I woke, drenched in sweat, I found the flyer lying on my nightstand, though I was certain I'd left it in the trash. The address was burned into my mind, as if etched there, and against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I felt an irresistible pull to go. The location was deeper into the industrial wasteland, a desolate lot surrounded by towering smokestacks that loomed like sentinels. In the center stood a massive, tattered tent, its stripes faded to a sickly gray and crimson, the flaps swaying gently though there was no wind. The air reeked of decay and something sweet, almost cloying, like rotting candy, and as I approached, the laughter started again, louder now, layered with whispers that beckoned me inside. The interior was impossibly vast, far larger than the tent should have allowed, and bathed in a dim, pulsing light that seemed to come from nowhere. The seats were empty, yet the air thrummed with the energy of a crowd, and at the center of the ring stood the clown. He was taller than I'd imagined, his limbs too long and thin, his head cocked at an unnatural angle as if studying me. His costume was a patchwork of stained fabric, and his face. His face was a grotesque parody of joy, with smeared paint that dripped like blood and eyes that burned with an unnatural golden light. "Welcome to the show," he crooned, his voice a sing-song mockery that sent shivers down my spine. The ground shifted beneath my feet as I tried to back away, the dirt turning to ash that swallowed my shoes, holding me in place. "You're the star tonight," he said, his grin widening as he gestured to a massive mirror that descended from the ceiling, its surface rippling like liquid silver. When I looked into it, I didn't see myself. I saw a twisted version of me, my face painted like his, my eyes hollow and glowing. I screamed, but no sound came out, and as I clawed at the air, the audience materialized. Rows upon rows of clowns, their faces grotesque masks of agony and madness, their laughter filling the space like a deafening roar. They clapped and cheered as the ringmaster approached, his long fingers reaching out to caress my face, leaving streaks of cold, wet paint that burned into my skin. "Once you're painted, there's no escape," he whispered, his breath rancid and cold as death. The mirror shattered, and the shards flew toward me, embedding in my flesh, each piece carrying a fragment of their laughter, their madness, until I could feel it burrowing into my mind. I tried to run, but the floor collapsed beneath me, and I fell into darkness, surrounded by swirling colors and the echoing laughter of the clowns. When I woke, I was back in my room, but the flyer was gone, and so was my reflection, replaced by the grinning visage of the clown, who now lives in the mirror, watching, waiting, his painted abyss ready to claim anyone who dares look too long. I had always been drawn to the quiet solace of late-night walks, the cool air wrapping around me like a comforting blanket, but that night, something felt off. A tangible heaviness in the air that seemed to whisper warnings I couldn't quite decipher. The small town I lived in was notorious for its eerie legends, but none struck fear into the heart like the tale of Grinner, the cursed clown said to haunt the forest just beyond the park. His legend wasn't one of ghostly moans or harmless pranks. No, Grinner was a creature of pure malice, a being that thrived on fear, his painted smile an eternal mask of mockery. That night, curiosity and my own arrogance pulled me toward the forbidden forest path. My flashlight beam wavered as the trees closed in, their skeletal branches clawing at the inky sky. The faint sound of a music box suddenly drifted through the air, its eerie, tinny notes both fragile and menacing, sending shivers crawling up my spine. I tried to rationalize it. A prank, a stray wind, but as I pressed on, the music grew louder, accompanied by a grotesque laugh that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. My heart pounded as I saw a faint figure ahead, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare given form. The clown was taller than any human should be, his striped costume ragged and stained, his face painted in grotesque detail, a white mask marred by streaks of blackened tears and a blood-red grin that stretched impossibly wide. His eyes, hollow and glowing with an otherworldly light, bore into mine, and in that moment, I felt utterly paralyzed. "Lost, little one?" His voice rasped, each word dripping with a venomous mockery that made my blood run cold. Before I could scream, his elongated fingers, tipped with claws that gleamed like rusted knives, stretched toward me, and I stumbled back, tripping over roots that seemed to grasp at my feet like skeletal hands. The flashlight rolled away, its beam flickering as the music box melody intensified, now interwoven with the anguished screams of voices I didn't recognize but instinctively feared. I scrambled to my feet, tearing through the underbrush, but every turn led me back to him. His laughter was relentless, each peal echoing in my mind, and then, as I paused to catch my breath, he was there. his grin inches from my face. "Run all you like," he hissed, his breath stinking of decay. "But the forest belongs to me." He didn't chase me, he didn't need to. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing into a clearing where the moonlight bathed the scene in a pale glow. It was then I realized I wasn't alone. Around me were others, motionless and pale, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their mouths stretched into unnatural, permanent smiles. Before I could scream, his shadow fell over me again, and his grin was the last thing I saw before darkness consumed me, leaving me with only the echo of his laughter and the eternal promise that I, too, would join his collection. Now, when people walk these paths and hear a distant laugh or the faint chime of a music box, they say it's the wind, but deep down, they know it's him. I had always thought myself immune to fear, too logical, too grounded for the kind of childish terror that haunted the weak-minded, until the night I found myself wandering the forgotten outskirts of town, where the decaying remnants of the Crimson Carnival lay in grotesque silence, hidden behind a veil of fog and decades of whispered warnings. It started innocently enough. A dare from friends I never should have trusted, a challenge to prove my bravery by venturing into the rusted gates of the carnival long after the sun had set. They laughed as I stepped through the creaking entrance, the air immediately thick with the rancid stench of mildew and something far worse, something metallic, like blood left to rot. The carnival was a graveyard of broken rides and tattered tents, their faded colors now dull and streaked with grime. But what unnerved me most was the absence of sound. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive silence that pressed against my skull. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper, past skeletal remains of roller coasters whose twisted tracks resembled gnarled claws reaching for the starless sky. Then I saw it, the clown. He stood at the end of the midway, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, his costume a chaotic mess of reds and yellows, torn and stained as if he'd clawed his way out of the grave. His face was painted in stark white, cracked and peeling like old porcelain, with crimson smears that exaggerated his jagged grin, and eyes so black they seemed to pull the light from the air. I froze as he tilted his head, an unnatural motion like a marionette jerked by invisible strings, and raised one gloved hand, beckoning me with a slow, deliberate gesture. My legs moved before my mind could stop them, each step closer amplifying the suffocating dread in my chest. His laugh was the first sound to break the silence, a deep, guttural chuckle that bubbled into a maniacal cackle, reverberating through the carnival as the rides began to move, creaking to life with a ghostly glow. The carousel spun, its horses now monstrous beasts with gaping maws, their eyes glowing with malevolence. The Ferris wheel groaned, its gondolas swinging violently, each one filled with shadowy figures screaming silently. And all the while, the clown watched, his grin stretching wider, impossibly wide, as if his face might split apart. "Welcome," he rasped, his voice a guttural blend of mockery and malice, "to the show that never ends." I stumbled backward, but the ground beneath me shifted, the once solid dirt turning into sticky, blood-soaked mud that clung to my shoes and slowed my retreat. Hands, small, pale, and clawed, shot out from the earth, grasping at my ankles, their grip icy and unrelenting. I screamed, yanking myself free and sprinting toward the exit, but the carnival twisted around me, its pathways looping back to the clown no matter where I turned. His laughter grew louder, the sound joined by a cacophony of whispers and cries, as if every soul ever trapped here had found their voice in torment. I found myself in front of a mirror maze, the clown now gone, but his reflection stared back at me in every pane of glass, each one closer than the last, until his grin filled the frame, his teeth jagged and glistening like shards of broken bone. The mirrors shattered as I ran, their shards cutting into my skin, but I barely felt the pain over the suffocating terror. When I finally burst into the open, I thought I was free until I saw them. The carnival was alive now, a pulsating nightmare of grotesque clowns, their laughter ringing in my ears as they danced and twisted, their faces melting and reforming into ever more horrifying shapes. At the center of it all stood him, the ringleader, his arms spread wide as if welcoming me into his hellish domain. "Stay," he whispered, his voice inside my head now. "You belong here." My vision blurred, my body trembling as the clowns closed in, their twisted limbs reaching for me. I screamed, but no sound came out, my voice stolen by the same curse that bound the others. And now I sit here, a part of the carnival, my face painted in eternal horror, trapped in a nightmare where the crimson carnival never dies, and the clown's laughter is all I'll ever know. It all started with the flyer, bright, garish colors boasting "Grinny the Clown's Carnival of Delights," pinned to a weathered bulletin board outside the gas station where I stopped to refuel late one night. Something about it caught my eye, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the clown's face, its oversized grin frozen in an expression so wide it bordered on grotesque, or the way the eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the flyer, shoving it into my pocket, but as I drove away into the quiet darkness of the highway, the image lingered in my mind, gnawing at my thoughts until I noticed something impossible. The carnival wasn't just on the flyer anymore. It was on the side of the road, lights flickering weakly in the distance, a sign with that same grinning clown beckoning me in. My car sputtered, the engine dying inexplicably as though the vehicle itself had conspired to trap me there. And with no other option, I stepped out into the cold, the thick fog swallowing the world behind me as I trudged toward the dim lights. The gate loomed over me, wrought iron twisted into an intricate pattern of faces all screaming silently. And as I passed through, the air shifted, heavy with a cloying sweetness that made me gag. The midway was deserted, the ride standing still as though frozen in time, their shadows long and sharp under the sparse illumination of flickering bulbs. A faint laughter echoed from somewhere deeper within, high-pitched and manic, sending chills down my spine as I approached an ancient funhouse with peeling paint and crooked windows. The words "Laugh Until It Hurts" scrawled in blood-red letters above the entrance. The door creaked open before I could touch it, revealing a corridor lined with warped mirrors, their surfaces rippling unnaturally, reflecting not just me but countless versions of myself, each one more distorted and sinister than the last. As I walked, the reflections began to move independently, their eyes hollow and their mouths stretching into impossibly wide grins that dripped with something dark and viscous. Then I saw him, or rather it. The clown stepped out from one of the mirrors, impossibly tall, its lanky frame folding and unfolding like a marionette as it moved closer. Its face was a nightmare of smeared paint and jagged teeth, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. "Welcome to the show," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural hiss that echoed around me, and before I could react, it grabbed my wrist with a hand far colder than any human touch should be, pulling me into the mirror itself. The world beyond was chaos, a twisted carnival of horrors where the ground writhed like flesh, and the sky bled colors that shouldn't exist. Figures roamed the midway, not quite human but not entirely monstrous, their laughter mingling with screams that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The clown was always just behind me, its footsteps unervingly silent despite its oversized shoes, its grin growing wider with every step I took. I stumbled into a carousel where the horses were alive, their skeletal bodies jerking and twitching as they neighed in agony, their empty eye sockets glowing faintly. As I turned to run, I tripped and fell into a ball pit filled not with plastic spheres but with disembodied eyes and teeth, each one gnashing and blinking as though alive. I screamed, clawing my way out, but the clown was there, waiting, its arms outstretched and its laughter a deep, guttural rumble that shook the very ground beneath me. "You can't leave," it said, its voice echoing inside my skull as the world around me began to warp and twist, dragging me deeper into its madness. My body refused to obey as I was pulled into a darkened tent, the air thick with the stench of decay, and the clown's face filled my vision, its grin now splitting its entire head in two. "The joke's on you," it whispered, and in that moment, I understood. I was the joke, the latest victim in an endless cycle of torment. Now, I'm trapped here, my face painted into a permanent grin, my laughter hollow and endless as I stand among the shadows of those who came before me, waiting for the next fool to stumble into the grinning abyss. It began with a dare, stupid, childish, and reckless, the kind of thing that only seems like a good idea when you're drunk on youth and invincibility. My friends, laughing and jeering, shoved me toward the crumbling remnants of Rictus Hollow, the infamous carnival grounds that had been abandoned for decades after the mysterious disappearance of over a dozen children. The stories about the clown, Giggles, had always been dismissed as urban legend, but standing there at the rusted gates, staring at the faded sign that still bore his grotesque, painted grin, I wasn't so sure. The air inside the gates was heavy, unnaturally cold despite the warm night, and the moment I stepped through, the laughter started, soft at first, like the faint echo of a bad memory, but growing louder, sharper, and more sinister as I moved deeper into the ruins. The rides were skeletal husks, their shadows twisted and jagged in the pale moonlight, and the carousel still creaked lazily as if invisible children were riding it. I told myself it was just the wind, but my heart hammered in my chest when the music started, tinny and off-key, the kind of warped melody you hear in nightmares. I turned to leave, but the gates were gone, swallowed by the suffocating darkness that now surrounded me. Panic clawed at my throat as I ran aimlessly through the maze of decaying booths and tents, every shadow seeming to reach for me, every sound magnified until it felt like the whole carnival was alive, breathing, waiting. And then I saw him. He was sitting on the edge of the dunk tank, his long legs swinging lazily, his oversized shoes scraping against the ground. His face was painted in garish white, with a grin so wide it seemed to split his head in two, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were empty voids that seemed to pull me in, making me forget how to breathe. "Why so serious?" he asked, his voice high-pitched and sing-song, but there was a razor-sharp edge to it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Before I could answer, he was standing inches away, though I hadn't seen him move, his breath cold against my face. "You came for the show," he whispered, and with a flick of his wrist, the carnival came alive. Lights blazed to life, casting everything in sickly, pulsating hues, and the laughter, the terrible, deafening laughter, was everywhere. I stumbled backward into the funhouse, its mirrored corridors warping my reflection into monstrous parodies of myself, each one grinning wider and wider until they weren't reflections at all. They stepped out of the mirrors, their hands grabbing at me, their laughter echoing mine, and when I screamed, it only made them laugh harder. I burst through a door, finding myself in the big top tent, its ceiling impossibly high, the walls alive with writhing shapes and faces that seemed to whisper my name. The clown was there, waiting in the center ring, juggling severed heads that giggled and winked at me as they spun through the air. "You're the main act," he said, bowing low with a flourish before pointing a long, skeletal finger at me. My body moved on its own, dragged into the spotlight by invisible strings as the audience. A sea of shadows with glowing eyes roared with laughter. "Smile," he hissed, and my face contorted against my will, my lips pulling into a grin so wide it felt like my skin would tear. The shadows surged forward, their hands clawing at me, pulling me apart piece by piece, and yet I didn't die. I was everywhere and nowhere, my screams drowned out by laughter, my soul stretched thin and tied to the carnival, an endless puppet in its eternal joke. Now I'm here, trapped with the others, part of the carnival's grotesque cast, waiting for the next fool to wander in and take my place under the spotlight. The clown still grins, his hollow eyes watching, always watching, as the joke plays on forever, and the laughter never, ever stops.